Our polity, the way we organise ourselves across the Uniting Church, involves not a hierarchy of top down to the bottom, but a series of interrelated councils. And you'll see there that the congregation and church council, that's really where there's so much responsibility is carried for the church. Most of the responsibility is there. And we have the presbytery, as you know, in our case, Support Philippines Presbytery, whose role is to ensure that congregations and other expressions of the church are well supported and overseen. That's an oversight role across the whole of this region. And then we have the Synod, which for the Uniting Church is the one place where we register ourselves as a legal entity. So that's the one, the body that holds all our property as far as the government's concerned. And we find the Synod provides resourcing in ways that we work together to do rather than all of us doing it alone. For example, the way we train our ministers together. And finally, the Assembly, which has an overview of our policies that relate to the whole of the United Church, as well as any ways in which we relate to the federal government and to our ecumenical partners across Australia and across the world. So there's a sense in which we have each of those councils have their own responsibilities, their own areas of work, and we work together where possible. And we could talk about that later on if you need to. So let's look at the role of the Church Council in the way it works with the congregation. Now, the first responsibility that is named in our regulations is about building up the congregation in faith and love. Now, that doesn't sound like a regulation, does it? But it actually is, it's saying that is our core responsibility for church councils, of developing the capacity of the congregation in terms of our relationship with God and how that's put into practice in the world today, and our relationships. So we're saying that relationships are core to how we see the Uniting Church, which is not surprising when you think of our name as the Uniting Church. It's about relationships all the way. Here's another one. An expression of that is sharing in pastoral care and spiritual oversight of the congregation. Now, it doesn't say do all the pastoral care and provide all the spiritual oversight of the congregation. We're saying sharing in that, in the sense that there are people who are gifted in pastoral care who are able to carry out their responsibilities and use their gifts, and they don't have to be on church council or to be an elder to do that. In the same way, we have people who are able to encourage discipleship and provide spiritual support for people who aren't on church council. But the church council has to have a sense of the overview and to take part. So rather than having the church council being just people who look at nuts and bolts and paying the bills and keeping the property going, we say primarily at the very heart of it, we're sharing in pastoral care and spiritual oversight. Here we are. And part of that is nurturing the congregation in their growth in grace. At some point in the life of a church council, you're going to have to grapple with people falling out with one another. I would say that one of the biggest challenges for any church is how do we learn to be growing in the art of forgiveness? How do we learn to grow in the art of restoring relationships? How do we ensure that we treat one another with generosity? And that's part of the role of the church council, is to nurture that sense. Okay, here's the Uniting Church regulations tell us that the church council should make decisions in keeping with the UCA regulations. Now, I think it's fair to say that we don't need to have the regulations out all the time, but in particular cases where there are things that we don't do very often, like electing new elders or church council members, or calling a minister, or buying or selling property, or having to face what we do with a obstreperous, difficult member, those kind of situations where they could go wrong and we could get into a big mess, that's when the UCA regulations have more detail for us. So keep in mind that the regulations generally provide a simple way of describing what we do that gives a lot of freedom for church councils to have their local way of doing things. But in some situations, we need to consult the regulations carefully. Here we are. And if you have a minister, it's important that the church council is in a collaborative and sharing relationship with the minister. And here's an example of in the conduct of worship and the sacraments. And I'm glad to say that when we run sacraments courses in the presbytery, like we did this year, it's not just people who are thinking about leading the sacraments who come to those courses. I encourage whole church councils to learn about the sacraments and learn about worship, so that we don't have just the minister or one or two people who are aware of what we're doing here. So that's an important part of the role of church council. Here's an interesting one. Have you ever tried changing the time and place of public worship? It's never as simple as you think, is it? It takes a lot of diplomacy to move the time of a worship service. And at the moment with COVID-19, that has been the responsibility of church councils, is working out how we're going to meet together in worship if we do. And if you think it's been difficult up to now, moving into a time of negotiating, coming out of restrictions, we're going to have to work really hard as church councils in exploring this whole area. Carrying out the functions concerning applicants for specified ministry. And those specified ministries are minister of the word, ministry of deacon, and lay preacher. And as coming new to the presbytery at Port Phillip East, I've noticed that we have a high dependence on clergy here. And we could, as a presbytery, be doing a lot more to encourage lay preachers. And likewise, a ministry of pastor, where lay people are in areas of ministry. The church council has a particular role, if you read Newsbeat this week, being a talent finder or a talent spotter, of finding people who have the gifts for ministry and encouraging them to not just try those gifts out, but to grow in their capacity. So that's a critical role for church councils. And in particular, people don't just put their hand up to be a minister. Often they are encouraged to be thinking about using their skills and gifts and graces. Managing the financial affairs and general administration. So this is a critical role. It's church councils have a governance role and also a management role. But we often find that we delegate some of these areas to a treasurer or to an administration group, so that the church council doesn't have to approve every invoice that comes through. I've had experience where the church councils had to debate what kind of smoke alarm they're going to put into the church. Well, that can be delegated, those kind of things. But having a sense of overview, which includes arranging for the audit and presentation and examination of the accounts. So it's a church council that does that. The treasurer can make a recommendation, but part of the role of the church council is to ensure that we have a transparent accountability structure where all our funding is up for review, not just by the church council, but by the whole congregation, by the presbytery and the synod, so that we have a sense of being accountable as the uniting church. Managing and controlling property. Now, we have said earlier that the Synod Property Trust is the trust that holds the title deeds for our property, but it's the responsibility of the local church to be thinking about, do you need to buy property, buy a manse, for example? Do you need to sell a manse? And we're wondering about that at the moment with unused manses for the Money for Mission project. And so it's a church council who, at the end of the day, make these decisions with the support of the presbytery and the synod. But the church council also needs to consult with the congregation. At the end of the day, it's a church council who hold this responsibility for what happens on the property as well. So occupational health and safety, that's a critical responsibility of the church council. Preparing and presenting annual reports to the congregation. And that's part of what we talked about earlier in terms of accountability, transparency, as well as stimulating the vision of the congregation. Annual reports shouldn't be just about where we've been, but also have a sense of where we're going. And that's part of the role of the church council, is to help the congregation have a sense of direction and movement. That can be fun. We can talk more about that later. Exercise oversight of appointment of officers and leaders of congregation organizations. And once again, you as a church council don't have to do all the appointing, but you're overseeing the way in which we do this. And that includes ensuring that we have people working with children's checks, or ensuring that people have had some discernment through the processes of being elected to roles in the church. And we can talk more about how we do elections as well. Refer matters to presbytery as required. Now, I know sometimes it may feel embarrassing or unnecessary to have the presbytery know what we're up to. If you're getting into strife, look, the presbytery at times gets a reputation for coming in and making things worse. But I think that we're making good strides as a presbytery in finding ways of supporting congregations to make progress in difficult issues, and in some cases finding ways of handling complex situations. For example, bringing churches together, selling property, trying to work out how to deal with difficult members, and that's a good example here. Exercising discipline on behalf of the congregation as appropriate. Now, we don't want any lashing or putting people in stocks. Obviously, discipline in this case is about paying attention to the way in which people treat one another in the congregation, or using their gifts, their roles with responsibility. And there are times when we need to sit down and talk through how people are operating. And there are some guidelines which we'll look at in the next session in 2 weeks' time about how we do this in terms of a code of conduct for lay leaders in the congregation. All right, so that's one of the examples of things we don't want to see happening too often, but it can be an option for a church council to explore. Okay, so how does this job description resonate or conflict with your church council experience? And what things might you like to see your church council begin doing or including? All right, so we're going to spend 10 minutes in our small groups now asking that question. How, out of the things we've looked at, and you can see in more detail in the manual or the handbook that we made available to you, what kind of things would you like to see your church council have a look at doing or including in the way you operate? Are there other things that you think are also important that we haven't talked about here that we might bring back to our discussion?